The mail-order bride thought no one wanted her until a little girl whispered, "Can you be my mommy forever?" Montana Territory, late autumn 1883. The wind had teeth that day. The last shriek of the train had long faded into the hills behind her. All that remained was the smell of coal smoke clinging to the air and the quiet echo of footsteps, the kind that belonged to people who had someone waiting for them. But Clara Ray was not one of those people. She stood alone on the wooden platform, her gloved hands gripping the handle of a worn carpetbag. The leather was faded, the stitching pulling loose at the corners. Her breath came in shallow bursts, visible in the crisp air, like ghosts trying to escape her chest. Dust danced around her boots, then settled quietly, as if even the wind had run out of things to say. Passengers had disembarked with cheerful calls, children running into the arms of mothers, ranch hands, calling out to brothers. Some were met by wagons, others by sweethearts or store owners. Smiles, hugs, names called aloud. But no one called for Clara. She waited until the last creak of a wagon wheel had disappeared down the trail into town. Only then did she sit on the edge of a bench carved rough and gray by time. The wood was cold through her skirts, but she sat stiff, almost formal, like posture alone might hold together what little pride she had left. From her coat pocket she pulled a folded letter. The creases were soft now, like cloth worn from too many readings. She didn't need to look at the words, she knew them by heart. I have a quiet home, a warm hearth, and a place for a kind soul to belong. Harland Kalulton. But there was no wagon, no Harland. Only silence, only her. She had come all this way, crossed counties, swallowed shame, sold off what little she had left for a promise, for one last chance at something resembling a life. And she had been left behind again. From the corner of the platform came a sound she knew too well, laughter, low and mocking. Two young men leaned against a barrel, eyes on her. One of them grinned wide and said loud enough for her to hear, "There she is, the half-blood bookkeeper. Thought she'd marry herself a rancher, did she?" Clara flinched, but didn't look at them. She had flinched too many times to bother hiding it now. This wasn't the first time. She had stood at the altar 3 times. Once the groom never showed. Once the mother answered the door and said her son had changed his mind. And the third had whispered, "You tricked me," after the ring was on her finger, and walked out before the ink on the marriage paper had dried. Each time they found out. About her mother. About the blood that ran through her. About how she had been raised. And each time the same shame that she was not just unwanted, but untouchable. Tears welled up, hot, sharp. She hadn't cried in public in years, but there in the middle of nowhere, Montana, she lowered her head as the letter crumpled in her lap and let the tears fall in silence. Until a new sound, soft, gentle, small footsteps on the wood. Then a voice, "Are you hurt? Sometimes it doesn't take a rescue to change your life. Just a question. Just a voice willing to care. And I wonder, have you ever felt like Clara, waiting somewhere, wondering if someone would come for you? Let me know, where are you listening from tonight? The prairies, the city, somewhere in between. Because the next part of this story, it starts with a child who didn't know anything about blood or shame, only that she saw a woman who needed someone to believe in her. Some walls are built so high even love can't climb them. But sometimes it only takes one question asked by the smallest voice to make everything come tumbling down. Clara blinked. At first she thought it was the wind again playing tricks on her ears, but no, there it was. That voice. Light and clear like birdsong in the middle of winter. "Are you hurt?" Clara raised her eyes. A little girl stood in front of her, no taller than her waist. She couldn't have been more than 3, maybe 4, dressed in a wool coat that swallowed her tiny frame. Mittens dangled from strings around her sleeves, and golden curls peeked out from beneath a knit cap pulled low on her forehead. The child stared at her with the kind of concern Clara hadn't seen in years. Not from adults, certainly not from strangers. Clara quickly wiped her eyes with her sleeve, trying to collect herself. "No, sweetheart," she said softly. "I'm just—" She tried to finish the sentence, but the words snagged in her throat like thorns. Finally, she forced a smile. "Just a little sad." The girl didn't smile back. She tilted her head, thoughtful, like she was puzzling something out. Then very seriously, "Did your daddy say no?" Clara blinked again. "No, darling. Do you have a husband?" Clara shook her head. "A baby?" Another small shake. Clara's voice, when it came, was a whisper. "Nobody wants me." The words slipped out before she could stop them. She hadn't meant to say that. Not aloud. Not to a child. But the girl didn't flinch or frown. She didn't ask why nobody wanted her. She didn't try to explain it away like adults often did. She simply stepped forward, mittened hand outstretched, and touched Clara's gloved fingers. Then, in the same voice as before, calm, sure, gentle, she asked, "Can you be my mommy forever?" The question didn't come with hesitation. It didn't come with doubt. It came like truth, pure and fearless. Clara froze. She stared at the little girl, her own heart caught between a sob and something she hadn't felt in a long, long time, hope. It didn't make sense. This child didn't know her, didn't know her past, didn't care about what was whispered in church pews or behind store counters. She just asked, and something inside Clara cracked. Something she thought had long since turned to stone. Before she could answer, another voice called from nearby. "Juny." Clara turned to see a man approaching. He was broad-shouldered and quiet in his step, with a worn coat and a hat that had seen many winters. He looked like someone who had once been strong and still was just quieter about it now. He rested a hand gently on the child's shoulder and nodded toward Clara. "Sorry. She's got a soft heart." Clara stood quickly, brushing the dust from her skirt. "She didn't bother me. Just surprised me is all." The man glanced at the letter still clenched in her hand. "You waiting on someone?" Clara hesitated. "I was. But it seems I've been fooled again." He nodded once, then looked down at the girl who was still holding Clara's fingers like they were something precious. "You've got no place to stay," Clara said. "But I'll manage." He stared at her a moment longer, then shifted the sack in his hand. "It's cold. I've got broth on the fire. You're welcome to rest a while." Clara blinked. "I don't even know your name." "Luke. Luke Harrison." He gestured down the trail. "It's not far. You can leave after supper if you still want to." Clara looked down at Juny, still watching her with those serious eyes. And with a breath she didn't know she was holding, she nodded. "Thank you." She didn't know it yet, but that tiny hand in hers was about to lead her home, not just to a house, but to a place where no one asked where she came from, only whether she was staying. And that cabin, that hearth, wasn't warm because of the fire. It was warm because no one made her explain herself to feel welcome. That's what she'd discover next. Some men shout their pain to the world. Others carry it like a loaded rifle close to the chest, never spoken of, always ready to go off. The path to Luke Harrison's cabin wound through tall pine and broken hills the kind of terrain where wind whistled like a warning and shadows stretched longer than they should. By the time they reached the hollow where his home nestled into the land, the sky had gone violet gray, the color of quiet endings. The cabin was small. One room, one porch, one narrow chimney releasing a thin ribbon of smoke. But there was something honest about it. It didn't pretend to be more than it was. Neither Clara suspected did the man who built it. Juny tugged gently at her hand. "It's warm inside," she whispered. Luke opened the door without ceremony. No words, no grand gestures, just a nod and space to walk in. Clara hesitated on the threshold. She had stood before many doors in her life, most of them closed, some slammed. This one was open, and it felt unfamiliar. Inside, the fire popped softly in the stone hearth. A rocking chair set nearby, a small table against the wall, one cot made up with careful hands. Everything was tidy, purposeful, like the man who lived there believed even silence should be put in its proper place. Luke gestured to a hook near the door. "You can hang your coat there." Clara didn't move. "I won't stay long." He didn't look up from unbuckling his boots. "That's up to you. I didn't ask you here to stay forever. Just the night." Her cheeks flushed. There was no warmth in his voice, but no malice either. Just plain truth, the kind that didn't bruise but also didn't bend. He moved to the hearth, stirred the stew pot, and said over his shoulder, "And for the record, I didn't write you any letters." Clara blinked. "You're not Harlan Kalulton." Luke huffed a dry sound, not quite a laugh. "Harlan's a stable boy. 16. Works for me sometimes. Got hold of the bride registry, thought playing matchmaker with strangers' lives might be a good joke." Clara stared at the floor, her hand tightening around the strap of her bag. "I see," she said quietly. Juny, sensing the heaviness in the air, climbed onto the bench by the fire and patted the spot beside her. "It's warmest here," she said. Clara sat. She didn't take off her gloves. They ate in silence. Luke said little. Clara said less. Only Juny, with her humming and soft slurps of stew, filled the room with any sound that wasn't aching. When the meal was done, Clara stood. "Thank you. I should go." But before she could reach the door, Juny slipped down from the bench and clung to Clara's skirts. "No," the child cried. "You said you didn't have a house. This is one." Clara bent down gently. "Sweetheart, this isn't my house." June's lower lip trembled. "It can be. Just for a little." Clara looked up, uncertain. Luke leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "She gets attached fast," he muttered. "I'll sleep in the barn. I can take the hearth," Clara offered. He shook his head. "You take the cot. I'll stay up." As she moved to unpack her bag, something caught her eye tucked in the corner behind folded blankets. A small dress. Beaded. Handmade. The kind worn by native girls. Beside it, a low shelf carved with care held a feather, a string of turquoise, and a pouch of dried sage. She stepped closer, her voice barely audible. She was Comanche. Behind her, Luke's voice came quiet and steady. "Kaioa. Her name was Weena. She died last winter. Fever came fast." Clara's hand hovered over the dress, her throat thick. "I'm sorry," she said. Luke gave no reply. Just tossed another log on the fire like he was trying to keep something else from going cold. There are men who bury pain, and then there are men who build cabins over it, feed fires through it, and raise daughters in the stillness it leaves behind. Clara had entered as a stranger. But tonight, as Juny drifted off to sleep, wrapped in blankets and calm breathing, Luke would offer Clara something he hadn't offered anyone since the day Weena died, a reason to stay. And by morning that offer would be tested in the heat of a child's fever. Some places make you explain yourself before they hand you a seat. Others just offer soup warmth and a silence that feels like permission to breathe. That night, the wind outside howled through the pines like something wounded, but inside the cabin, there was only the crackle of firewood and the quiet rustle of breath. Juny had fallen asleep, curled beside the dog, a ragged quilt tucked up to her chin. Her little hand still clutched the edge of Clara's skirt, like she didn't trust the woman to stay. Clara hadn't moved not because she couldn't, but because for the first time in years, she didn't feel the need to leave. She sat on a low stool by the fire shawl, wrapped tight around her shoulders, and stared into the flames like they might have answers. Luke hadn't said much since supper. He sat by the door sharpening a knife that didn't need sharpening, eyes focused on the blade like it gave him a reason not to look at her too long. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was just still. A kind of stillness Clara had forgotten how to sit inside. There were no questions about her name. No sideways glances at the color of her skin. No one whispering half-blood like it was a slur they didn't want to touch with their own mouths. Just warmth, and space, and the faint smell of pine and broth. Clara let her eyes wander the handmade shelf near the fire, the wooden spoon worn smooth with use, the boots set neatly by the door. Everything in this home had been touched by care. Even the quiet seemed placed there on purpose. Luke finally spoke. "You can stay a few days," he said, not looking up. "She sleeps better when you're here." Clara blinked. "That's kind of you." He shrugged. "Not kind. Just true." She looked down at Juny, who murmured something soft in her sleep, and tugged a little tighter at Clara's skirt. "That's all right," Clara said, voice low. "I won't ask for more." Luke nodded once and went back to his blade. They didn't speak again that night. But something was changing. She could feel it not in words, but in the way the fire didn't dim too low, in the way Juny breathed easier, in the way Luke didn't ask her to explain where she came from, or why she'd been crying at the train station, or what kind of woman came all the way to Montana on a lie. This hearth wasn't warm because of the fire. It was warm because no one made her prove she deserved to be near it. Sometimes safety isn't loud. It's quiet enough to let you rest your guard for the first time in years. But peace, like winter fire, is fragile. And when morning comes, it won't be Clara's story or scars that matter. It'll be whether she can save the one child who trusted her with everything. Because by nightfall, Juny's little hand will go cold. Some lessons aren't learned in books. They're handed down in whispers and herbs in moments no one else dares to step into, until it's life or death. It began with a shiver. At first, Clara thought Juny had simply kicked off her quilt. But by dusk, the girl lay curled on the cot, cheeks flushed and damp, her breath coming in shallow little gasps. The cabin, once warm and still, now pulsed with worry. Luke stood over his daughter, cloth in hand, useless. His hands, the same ones steady with hammer or rifle, now trembled against her burning skin. "She was fine this morning," he muttered. "Just a sniffle." Then she got quiet. Too quiet. Clara was at his side in seconds. She pressed her palm to Juny's cheek. The heat there was sharp and deep like fire under ice. "She has a fever," Clara said. "A bad one." Luke's mouth tightened. "Can we take her to town?" Laura shook her head. "Not tonight. Roads are frozen, and she won't survive the ride." He began to pace. "I don't know what to do." Clara's voice was calm but certain. "I do." She crossed to her satchel and began to unpack dried roots bundles wrapped in cloth, tiny vials filled with oil and powder. Her hands moved with quiet purpose, the kind that came from remembering, not guessing. "My father was a Kaioa medicine man," she said softly. "He taught me what to do when no one else would come." Luke didn't interrupt. He just watched, arms folded, shoulders rigid, as Clara boiled water, crushed herbs, soaked linen in bitter brew. She placed warm cloths on Juny's chest, murmuring words he didn't understand but didn't dare question. "She needs to sweat it out," she explained. "If she does, we have a chance." Luke knelt beside the cot. "She's all I have." Clara didn't look up. She kept working. Steady, fierce, focused. She spooned bitter tea past Juny's lips, wiped sweat from her brow, hummed an old song her mother once sang to orphans who'd lost everything but breath, and maybe not even that. Hours passed. The fire popped. The room dimmed and flared again. Juny moaned once, then again. And just before dawn, her tiny hand moved. Her eyes fluttered open. "Mommy," she whispered. Clara froze. Luke inhaled sharply, but didn't say a word. Juny's hand reached for Clara's, wrapped around it, and held tight before sleep pulled her under again. Silence settled. Not heavy, just still. Luke stood slowly, looked at Clara like he hadn't before. "You saved her," he said. His voice was low, grateful, changed. Clara swallowed. "I couldn't let her go." "You didn't." The world had always told Clara that what was in her blood made her lesser. But tonight, it made her everything. If this part of the story touched you even a little, let me know by typing 1 in the comments. If it didn't, that's okay too, type 0. I'd still love to know. But stay close, because next, Clara won't just be needed. She'll be chosen. It's one thing to be needed. It's another to be wanted. But being chosen, truly chosen, that's something rare enough to change a life. The fire had burned low, casting the room in a soft red glow. Clara sat wrapped in a quilt near the hearth, her body heavy with exhaustion, but her mind too full to rest. Juny lay nearby, her fever-broken cheeks flushed pink, not with sickness, but sleep. Across the room, Luke hadn't moved for over an hour. He just sat, elbows on knees, watching his daughter breathe. Clara had seen men grieve before. But this was different. This wasn't mourning. This was a man realizing he nearly lost everything again and didn't. Finally he stood, walked across the room, and crouched beside her. "You could have died," he said, his voice barely more than gravel. "You went into that cold for her. And then you stayed up all night to fight for her again." Clara didn't respond right away. Her fingers curled slightly around the cup in her hands, still warm. "She called me Mommy," Clara said softly. "I wasn't sure if she meant it." Luke met her eyes. She meant it. There was a long silence between them. But this time it wasn't awkward. It was full. "Don't go," he whispered. "Don't leave again, Clara. Don't." Her breath caught, not because of the words, but because of the way he said them. Not as a man trying to claim her, but as a man who had just realized he didn't want to wake up without her in the next room. "I wasn't planning to," she whispered. Luke reached for her hand, slow, unsure, and when she didn't pull away, he closed his calloused fingers around hers, like a promise he didn't know how to put into words. And for the first time, Clara didn't feel like someone being tolerated. She felt kept. Some stories are carried like secrets, others like scars. But the hardest to tell are the ones that ask, am I allowed to exist and still be loved? The stars above Montana stretched wide and bright, scattered like cold embers across the sky. Clara stood on the porch, wrapped in a shawl mug of tea, warming her hands. The air was sharp, but it didn't bite the way it used to. Luke leaned against the railing, shoulders stiff, breath curling in the dark. He didn't speak. He rarely did unless the words mattered. For a long while, the only sound was the fire cracking inside and the soft sigh of wind through the pines. Then Clara broke the silence. She asked me again tonight, she said quietly. Luke turned, brow furrowing. Juny Clara nodded. She asked if I had a mommy. He waited. I told her I did once. A woman who held my hand when I cried, who sang to the stars like they were her sisters. Luke looked at her, really looked. Your birth mother, Clara shook her head. No. She died the night I was born. She took a breath, letting it settle in her chest. My mother was Kaioa, a medicine woman. She raised me after the tribe took me in. My father, her voice faltered but didn't break, was a cavalry officer. Some say he cared. Others say he didn't. I never met him. And I don't want to. Luke stayed quiet. I was the child nobody wanted to claim, she said. Half Comanche, half ghost. Towns didn't want me. Neither did most of the tribe. I grew up in the space between. She stared at the horizon where dark hills rolled like sleeping giants. When I was 17, a trader said I was too pretty for a teepee, promised a job, a life. I left. Thought I could become someone new. Luke's jaw tightened. But every man who promised me a future ran when they found out who I was, what I was, even the one who stood beside me at the altar. He said nothing, just stepped closer until they stood side by side. Then his voice quiet and steady. I once knew a man who said blood tells the truth of a person. Clara turned to him. Do you believe that I did? Luke said. Until I had a daughter with skin darker than mine, and the world told me she wasn't whole. But she's the best thing I've ever done. Clara's throat closed, not from grief, but from being heard. Love is not always born in warmth. Sometimes it's forged in ice-cold water in the split-second choice to risk everything, not because you're supposed to, but because your heart already decided. The wind shifted that afternoon, sharp and biting, the kind that carried warnings, not just cold. Clara had just finished hanging a quilt to dry when she noticed it. Silence. Not the good kind. Not the peaceful hush of a sleeping child or a snow-covered morning, but the hollow silence that made the hairs on your arms stand up. Juny, she called. No answer. Her eyes scanned the yard. The quilt dropped from her hands. The gate near the tree line hung open, creaking in the wind. Panic rose like a wave. She ran, boots pounding across frozen ground. Juny. She followed the trail, small footprints uneven, and hurried down the slope toward the sound of water. Then she heard the scream. A splash. Hope and horror. Down by the edge of the creek, Juny flailed in the icy current, swept off her feet, her little hands clawing at a branch slick with frost. Hold on, Clara cried, already tearing off her coat, not thinking, only moving. The water was a blade cutting through her skin, her spine, her lungs. She gasped, stumbled, kept going. I've got you, sweetheart. I've got you. She reached Juny just as the child slipped beneath the surface. Clara grabbed her by the arms, heaved her up, braced herself against a half-submerged rock. Hold tight, she gasped. Don't let go. Juny clung to the stone. But Clara's foot was trapped between two river stones. The cold turned her muscles to fire. Her breath grew ragged. Her arms shook. The last thing she saw before the world blurred was Juny's face, pale, wet, terrified. Then everything went dark. Luke heard the scream before he saw the river. He didn't stop to grab a coat. Didn't stop to think. He ran fast, silent, like a man chasing the only thing left that mattered. And then he saw her. Juny clinging to a rock. Clara floating. He plunged into the water without a word. One arm for Clara. One for Juny. "It's okay," he whispered through chattering teeth. "I've got you. I've got you both." Some bonds are written in ink, others in cold water and burning lungs and arms that refuse to let go. Clara survived, but only barely. And as the fire roared high that night, and Luke held her body close, willing warmth back into her limbs, he finally said the words he'd been afraid of for far too long. Weddings speak in promises. But sometimes the deepest vow comes from the smallest voice asking with all the hope in the world if you chose them, and if you'll stay. Clara woke to warmth, not just from the fire still burning strong in the hearth, or the layers of blankets Luke had wrapped around her in the night, but from something deeper. Juny's little body curled against her side. A heartbeat, a breath, a child who had nearly been lost. Luke sat nearby, boots off, eyes heavy from a night with no sleep. He didn't say anything when Clara stirred, just reached out and brushed a damp curl from her forehead, so gently, like touching something already broken. "She's safe," he whispered, "because of you." Clara's lips parted, but her voice came hoarse. "I couldn't let her go." Luke's voice cracked. "You didn't." She looked at him, really looked. Not as the man who found her on a train platform, not as the stranger who offered soup and shelter, but as someone who had stayed, someone who had run into a frozen river for the same child. Luke lowered his head. "Don't ever leave again, Clara. Don't. Please." Her fingers reached out, weak but certain, and closed around his. "I wasn't planning to." And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, not romance, not passion, but something firmer, something steadier, belonging. The next morning, the cabin was still. Light filtered through the window, casting soft gold across the floorboards. Clara had just begun to sit up when Juny, barefoot and wide-eyed, clambered onto the bed, dragging her rag doll behind her. She stopped short, climbed up beside Clara, and looked her in the eye. "You woke up," Juny whispered. Clara smiled through tears. "I did, sweetheart." Juny hesitated, then leaned in, pressing her forehead gently to Clara's. And then she asked it. The same question, but not the same way. This time it wasn't whimsy. It wasn't curiosity. It was a child asking for a vow. "Can you be my mommy forever?" Clara's heart clenched. Her arms trembled not from the cold, but from the weight of finally being wanted. She gathered Juny close, kissed the top of her golden curls, and whispered, "Yes, baby. If you'll have me, I will." Juny nodded fiercely, as if sealing something sacred, then nestled close, content at last. At the doorway, Luke stood watching. He didn't speak, didn't step in, just let the moment be what it was. But his eyes, those quiet, weathered eyes, said everything. You don't have to give birth to someone to become their mother. You just have to say yes when no one else ever has. And in the next breath of their story, that yes will echo not in a vow made to a child, but in a wedding without rings beneath the golden sky of Montana. Montana. 1 year later. The wind still howled across the plains, but it no longer sounded lonely. Clara stood in the doorway of the cabin, one hand resting on her round belly, the other holding a basket of herbs. Behind her, Juny's laughter rang like music through the house, her feet pattering across the wooden floor, chasing the family dog with a ribbon tied to its tail. Luke was in the yard humming softly as he planted late-season onions. He paused only to glance toward the porch and smile. The cabin had changed. So had they. There was a second room now, a new roof patched twice, a line of herbs drying above the windows and shelves filled with glass jars, salves, books, and folded quilts. But the most important thing hung above the door. A sign hand-carved, now weathered by sun and snow, Ray and Harrison herbs, and help. At first the townsfolk had stayed away, but Clara never turned anyone down. Children came first, drawn in by curiosity and kindness. Then the mothers. Then old men with aching knees. No one asked about her blood anymore. They just called her Miss Clara and meant it. And Luke, he didn't speak much unless Juny was involved. Then his voice became light, alive. Home. They had no preacher, no rings, just vows exchanged under the sycamore tree where Juny once danced in the snow. Clara wore a dress she stitched herself. Luke held her hand like it had always been there. That night, their son was born into firelight, into love, into the arms of a man who once believed he'd never have a family again. Not all homes are inherited. Some are built with hands, with hope, with choices made one quiet day at a time. What about you? Was there ever a moment in your life when you felt truly chosen, not because someone had to, but because they wanted to? Tell me your story in the comments. Or leave a, if you're still waiting for your moment. It might be closer than you think.